So whether you've been producing for a while or you've just started out with producing, at some point you're going to reach a stage where you want to collaborate with someone. Whether we're talking about this in a professional setting, meaning that you want to send your production over to a mixing engineer, or you're just want to like collaborate with one of your friends working on a song together. There are two ways to go about this. One is what I absolutely do not recommend, but you can do it. But and then the second way, which I will highly recommend. So let's start with the first one. What I don't recommend is to actually send over the project file for collaborations, because so first of all, like maybe you can kind of pull this off if both of you are using the same exact setups, meaning you both use, let's say, FL Studio, and you're also not using any third-party plugins. In this case, maybe this is gonna work. What you'll find in many cases is that right away at the very beginning of this discussion with the DAWs, this whole thing will just fall apart, because you work in, let's say, Ableton, and your friend is working in Cubase, and like this is just not gonna fly like that. And then even if there's let's say both of you are working in Logic, just like where I prefer to work, then there's gonna be the issue with the third-party plugins. Let's say one of us have the UAD plugins, one of us have a lot of let's say FabFilter plugins and whatnot, and the other person doesn't. And so like the plugin like compatibility issues can also just come up in general. For example, with Waves, it's like notoriously bad. Let's say you're using the Waves like version 15 plugins, your collaborator or like the mixing engineer even has like version 13, and the stuff just won't load up. So it's just not really gonna like work out in any sort of real life scenario. It's in theory it's possible, but I just absolutely do not recommend to send over project files for any sort of collaborations or professional situations even. There's only kind of like one like exclusion, because for example, but this is not really going to be applicable for anyone who I don't think who's watching this video, because in professional circles, so let's say when we're talking about the Ariana Grande or like the Justin Biebers, it's very well known that there's going to be like 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10 people working on the background or even on just one song. And in what happens in many cases is that even before you get to this quote-unquote mixing stage of any given particular project, there's already someone who's stamped down the session and moved everything over to Pro Tools. And in those cases, those Pro Tools sessions will most likely be able to be just sent over directly to the mixing or mastering engineers, and that's gonna sometimes work. Although for my own personal works, I still will almost always request stem downs, even in situations like this, because I just don't really like Pro Tools myself. So like I can use it kind of, but I don't really like the workflow necessarily. So I just much prefer to work in Logic. And so we've reached this kind of like conclusion that we kind of need to stem down our production to be able to collaborate with anyone in any sort of effective manner, because otherwise it's just not really going to be effective. Like really, that's the best word to use here. So let's talk about how to do this. I work in Logic, but the same principles will apply whether you're stemming down from Ableton. It's just the buttons are going to be at different places, and you have to like rename channels maybe differently. It's just that the principles that matter here, that I kind of want to go through them. So first of all, you kind of want to name your channels. So this is my recent remix of Here Comes the Rain Again, but I'm not going to play any audio from this, because it just doesn't really matter from our discussions perspective right now. It's just something that I wanted to pull up to kind of demonstrate how I would stem it down. Even and this is actually what I did, because this is the production project of that particular remix. And then I stemmed this session down, and I moved everything over to a mixing project. Even for myself, I find it much better to work with stems instead of like trying to mix with software instruments, because so for example, I'm going to bounce one instance of this in place, and I'm going to bounce two instances of this in place. So these are in theory are the same things, right? But you can right away see that the waveforms are going to be different with each bounce. Even if they are sounding like somewhat similar, they are not exactly a carbon copy of each other. Like even if I zoom in, like you can see that these things are at different points. In theory, this might not be like all that big of a deal, but it's not the same thing. So basically, if I put on an EQ on this one, or like a compressor on this particular channel, it's going to affect it differently. Like even if it's just a very slight difference than this one. So it's right away we already kind of see like what's the benefit of bouncing down something into audio from a software instrument. because then the audio content of it is always going to be the same thing, whatever happens, because the audio is not going to change. But the software instrument, so the actual synthesis can be different from time to time. Not to mention another huge benefit in terms of working with audio is that, for example, in situations like this, when things are in MIDI, I can, even if I set the ending here, and even if I set like a seemingly perfect release time in whatever synth I'm in, like even to 0, sometimes what's going to happen is that the tails are going to be overflowing. So in this case, I can edit the audio to end wherever I actually want the sounds to end, and then just maybe put a little bit of a fade there so that it doesn't click. But so these are just the kind of the concept that I want to kind of talk about, why it's extremely beneficial right away in the very beginning to start out the mixing process with stems instead of like software instruments, because it's just not going to be the same thing every single time. So hopefully this makes sense. Let's just start naming the channels what they are. So this is a kick. Okay, that's amazing. And then I have the sub, which I labeled myself as a muted channel, because I just wasn't sure if I'm gonna need this. You can label these things however you want, but these things are always better like clarified in the emails or the messages that you send out, instead of just writing it into the actual name of the channel if you're working with someone else. Like if you're just bouncing down a session for your own self to work on it later, then you obviously can label it however you understand it, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, that's how I labeled this myself. So I've had this as a sub channel. This is the bass. This is also a copy of the bass, and this is a bass pad. And again, so just to touch on this audio thing once again, I bounced this was also like a software instrument how I generated this bass pad, obviously. But the reason I bounced it into audio is because, once again, the tail was not ending here 100%. So what I did is, like, obviously I just bounced it into audio file, and then I was able to just simply cut down the part which I didn't want to have here anymore. It's this simple. And even if I mix a session and sometimes I want to do this instead of automation, if I can just simply select it and delete it, it's just a lot easier to do this. Now, I don't necessarily even remember what these things are, but I believe this is some sort of a tremolo layer. So let's call this like sample tremolo. Amazing. Probably this is the same thing, and this is the same thing. And then these are some sort of brass stabs. Okay, this is some sort of a bass stab. And then I'm just going to name these sessions, and I'm probably going to fast forward this part of the video, because what I'm doing here is literally just naming the stems in some sort of a way where it's very easy to understand which things are belong kind of together. And so yeah, we're largely done. And as far as the vocal channels go, so this is going to be different with every single session. Like sometimes you're going to be working with samples instead of like clear acapellas. And in this case, because this is just a remix instead of an original song, I don't have access to the completely dry vocal channels. But even in a situation like this, what I would highly recommend is to take off all the delays that you have on the vocals, even the side chains, possibly, like all the reverbs. Like if you're working with just your friend and you're just collaborating on a song, this might not be necessary. In fact, maybe your friend will actually want to receive all the stems with all the effects on them. You've been working on this song for a while, so you're kind of used to how some things are sounding. At this point in time, if you believe that something is sounding good, then it's good. It's like probably won't even really need to be touched in any sort of major way. So in my experience, things can only get worse if you take off these EQs or whatever other adjustments that you've made to your kick, for example. So the whole point is that when it comes to the instrumental stems, I would highly recommend leaving every single insert effect on them when you're stemming down the session. Now, sidechains are kind of a different animal, and this is going to be different from one engineer or like one collaborator of yours to another. I personally prefer if I receive stems without sidechain, but I want to have your reference of how how you imagined your sidechain, like how it sounded in your project file. And the reason for this is like, it's kind of arrogant, I guess, but it's just because that I believe that I've been doing this for so long that I can set up sidechains much better than most other people can. And also because like most people just do these, I don't want to say that it is necessarily a bad thing, but Kickstart, for example, is never going to work the same way how a sidechain compression, like an actual compressor plugin would work. And this one, to me at least, is just so much more customizable. I can just set up the sidechain exactly how I think is going to be working best with any sort of like kick drum or whatever else I'm going to be sidechaining stuff against. Sometimes I will ask to have all the sidechains also like left on with all instruments. So this is kind of a case by case basis. It really just depends on the actual production itself, but I would say that 75% of the time I will ask for stems without any sort of sidechaining, and like 25% is where I will say that, okay, this sidechain is sounding good enough, I don't really think I will need to remake it and I don't need to touch it, so it's good to go already. But when it comes to the vocals, I will 95, let's say, percent of the time I will ask for no reverbs, no delays, or like the best thing is if you have it routed to either to like a sense, so that if you have your reverbs or delays on different sends, or how I sometimes set up these reverbs myself is that I clone the channel and I add the reverb here and I set it to 100%, and then I have, you know, the dry whatever I have, and then just the delay on another completely different channel. But this is kind of like you need some sort of an experience to work with this, because it's not that easy to maneuver, and then it's a lot of things to pay attention to. But the whole point being is that if you're using delays or reverbs on inserts, and this is also why I pulled up this session, because I remember that this is how I did it here, and I can like demonstrate this here the best, is that I would highly recommend to get rid of this delays or reverbs or whatever you have on any sort of channels, and also the sidechains from the vocal. That's always best to be done like this. Now, as far as grouping goes, I don't think I have any sort of grouping going on in this particular session, although let me just check. No, I don't see any. But let's say group these kicks together, and this is perfectly fine when for example you stem down the session when I have all access to the individual channels as well, and I have an access to, let's say, a kick group. And if you stem your session like this, I receive the group as well and the individual elements as well. Grouping, when things don't overlap, is generally speaking is just fine, because like even let's say these things are okay, I don't know why this happened, but so let's say this, when I receive it in a group channel, let's say this is called kick group whatever. If I really need to separate these things into different channels, I can just do this and, you know, call it a day, and this is no harm was done. But problems happen with grouping is when things that are overlapping or what are being grouped, because these things I cannot separate anymore from one channel. Like there's no way for me to do this. And this is especially problematic with basses, because this is what happens a lot, is that people don't pay attention to properly accommodating for frequencies. The whole point is that I'm just going to open up a new EQ to kind of like show it like this. It's like in this kind of range, like in the sub range, there's only room. Like if you want your song to be easily digestible, then you really don't want more than one thing playing in this range in terms of like melody. Like obviously you're going to have your kick drum here, and you're going to have some sort of a bass, but it has to be a bass and like one bass and not more basses. Like everything else that's layered on top of it is like has to like start around 100. But that's even, you know, in many cases are going to be already kind of sketchy. But the good thing about this is that if you send this central project to me or like anyone else who understands these types of principles as separate individual channels instead of like something that would be grouped, like then I can just figure this out on my own, and then, you know, do the processing that's, you know, appropriate to every sort of situation. And I can do this if things are individually stemmed down. But if, for example, you know, the sub and the bass, another bass that's, you know, processed like wrong in a sense, are being put together into one group, and I only receive the group, like, you know, like something like this. I could create summing stacks too, but it's just, for me, this is the easier way to go. So I only receive this aux 2, for example, then I won't be able to do the best job that I would otherwise be able to do. The whole point is that you always want to send over all the individual channels. This is the main idea. But at the same time, you can kind of create these sort of like subgroups alongside the individual channels. So this is going to be like, let's say, a base group. And then you're gonna have like a sample group, and etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to set up all these groups because this is kind of self-evident what I'm doing here. I would like group together the rest steps, the bass steps, the vocal synths, the transcript, whatever. And this is not necessary really, but this could also kind of like if you want to process things together on these groups, like this is kind of the way to do it. And because this way, for example, if you send your stems to me for mixing, like whatever project you're working on, I can kind of listen to the group, like what's the processing difference between this and the sum of the individual elements, and I can kind of recreate the group. But at the same time, I'm also going to have access to the individual elements in any group, and then I can make the adjustments that are going to be kind of like necessary, like in terms of like respecting physics in the case of, for example, like two basses playing together, and yeah, just make the adjustments that are necessary in any given situation. So let's say, you know, we're done with this project, we're happy with everything, the naming is done properly, like everything is named, the kick is the kick, it's not just called like 007 whatever type of sample pack name, whatever type of artist name, I don't know, like it's a kick is called a kick, and like a loop is called a loop, a hi-hat is called a hi-hat, and the snare is called a snare, and this is what really matters. Like even if you don't take the time to like name every like effect as an effect itself, like sometimes if you have, for example, like a Vengeance sample that's, you know, called like Vengeance, I don't know, whatever, VEC for down lifter sample I don't know, 104, then you can kind of leave it like that, because that's kind of obvious, like still what that is. But it's just not really all that good when I can't, you know, tell what's what just by looking at the name. And this is true for any other collaborator that you're ever going to work with. It's like it's always better to just look at things and already understand kind of what it's going to be. And yeah, so let's say we are done with all this. Now let's take a look at the export panel. Like I'm working in Logic, so I'm going to talk about these things in Logic, but the same principles would apply if I were in Ableton, or if I were in let's say FL Studio or whatever other DAW. Now, include the tempo information, you can include or not. I'm gonna be able to figure out the tempo. Like for me, this is not really a huge issue, but maybe let's leave this ticked in. It's like not you have nothing to lose. Now, normalization is people very often misunderstand this, what this means. Normalizing basically means that each and every channel will be brought up to peak at 0 dB. Now, I don't necessarily recommend doing this. You can do this, like you're not going to be doing all that huge of a harm, but if you want your stem down to kind of sound like how you had it in your session, then you just want to like either take in the off setting or the overload protection only. Include volume/pen automation, like obviously if you have any in your sessions. Now, as far as automations go, like this, just so to touch on this for a second, if you want to automate the volume or like the panning, I would highly recommend to automate these things inside of, let's say, an equalizer plugin like the ProQT tree, where you have like a separate control. And this way, when you want to just set the fader to like a lower or higher amount, it's not going to jump into the automation value. And obviously there are workarounds to this, like setting it to latch or write or whatever, but I just think these things are complicating the workflow for no reason, and it's much simpler to look at an automation coming from another plugin instead of the fader, which you might, eventually just, you simply can sometimes forget that you automated a fader, you set the level down because you noticed that something was a little bit too loud, let's say, and then, the fader jumps back once the automation kicks in, and it's just going to be no good. But I just kind of wanted to touch on this. This is not really related to stemming down anything. So including audio tail, I usually like to have this option ticked in also, because what can sometimes happen is, let's say I have this is not very real life situation, but sometimes let's say you have a reverb on, let's say your kick drum. Now, if you don't tick in the audio tail settings, what might sometimes happen is I'm gonna get a stem like this. I'm just going to bring up the waveform just so that it's obvious. Is this waveform should continue here, but it doesn't. It just cuts off here abruptly. And so with a kick drum that has reverb on this, it's not really all that big of a tragedy. But in case of, let's say, like a synth that would have like otherwise a nice delay or like a nice reverb, like fading out, that's gonna be cut off from your stem down, and I'm not gonna receive it. And there's I cannot really remake it the same way how it would have been generated otherwise. So I would also kind of recommend to tick in this include audio tail option. Bit depth, I always recommend 24-bit. 16-bit and 24-bit, hard to hear, but there is going to be a difference. And this is not even about your hearing, but when, let's say and this is very obvious when you do this with MP3s, for example. But so if this channel, for example, if this is in 32-bit, when I do like an EQ move like this, my processing is going to sound entirely different than if I do this same EQ move with just an MP3 quality type of sound or whatever. And the reason being is because, let's say, once again, I'm kind of like exaggerating this, because MP3 conversion is like extremely lossy. Like most people already know this who are working with any sort of audio. But in case it's not obvious to anyone, the MP3 conversion, the whole point of it is to save space, so that like one song does not consume, let's say, 50 megabytes, but instead just only 5 megabytes. And the way this is done is that there's a hard cut filter, like around, I don't remember the exact numbers, but around like 19,000 hertz or something. There's also like a hard cut like around 20. And you also have a lot of like these. It doesn't really necessarily work like this, but it's best illustrated like this. So there's a lot of these notches, which are also like taking out a lot of space. So this is how you manage to save so much space. But obviously, when I'm trying to after this fact, when I'm trying to EQ like this, I'm already EQing some of these artifacts that were created by this conversion process, and that's never going to sound as high quality as if you never did this in the first place. And so this is why I think the best way to go around things is to always you can also bounce in 32-bit compared to 24. When your DAW is computing or like processing anything, it always works in 32-bit. But it's kind of like, in my personal opinion, like 32-bit is kind of like overkill compared to 24. Like that's 24 is generally speaking going to be more than good enough, like way more than good enough for most things. Like if you want to go higher than 24-bit, the actual processing, like you want to kind of think about these things in terms of dynamic ranges, because 24 bits is like, I don't know, 120 decibels or in terms of like range. So if you want to make more than 120 dB of up or down moves in terms of EQing, then yeah, sure, switch to 32. But this is not really a real life situation, in my opinion, at least. And then when I work in Logic, like I prefer to like set the cycle, like which is like this one, to the actual length of what I want to bounce. And then I also select here this export cycle range only, instead of like trim silence at file end, because then once again it's the same thing as the audio tail option. It can potentially, like, it can only cause issues in terms of what your partner or like your engineer is going to receive, and you're going to be saving some space, but it's kind of just, in my opinion at least, it's pointless. Like saving space is not that important, in my opinion at least. And in Logic now also, I believe you have these same options, or like somewhat similar in Ableton. It doesn't work exactly the same way, but you can just name things manually. Is that I prefer to have the track number and the track name already added to the stem down, and then I'm just gonna hit export, and then the session is going to be exported, hopefully without any issues. And then whenever me or like whoever you're sending your stems, your collaboration partners are going to be receiving your stems, they are already going to receive it with the name like 2 kick, 3 kick, 4 kick, and every stem is going to be very obviously set up the same way, both in terms of your own like top to bottom arrangement because of the numbers, and both the names because how you named the names in your session. And so it's going to be very easy to work with it right away. And yeah, this is how I would highly recommend to to stem down your sessions, and how to collaborate with other people. Another thing which I almost forgot to add is to turn off any sort of dithering. Dithering does not do anything good in terms of like production or mixing. These are dithering only is like ever necessary when you work 16-bit or under and at the mastering stage. This has no benefit ever in any other situation at all. So yeah, please make sure to turn off dithering. Never use dithering when you're stemming down anything, any project. Obviously, like if you've been doing this for a while and if you have your set collaboration partners, then you're eventually going to develop your own kind of procedure. But if you're just sending out stems for the first time ever, basically for anyone, then this is kind of a foolproof way of doing it, because no one's going to ever say anything bad about like this type of method. So yeah, hopefully this all makes sense. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.